Hi there, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Some technical difficulties on my side. Welcome. I'm here to talk to you about MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE D3FEND. Real quick, just a background. My name is John Mancini. I'm joining you from Vectra AI, where we use AI to detect and respond to threats in public cloud, data center, SaaS, and identity. My personal background is I am a product manager and former data scientist. My kind of day-to-day with MITRE has been pretty heavy throughout the years. I've worked with customers in helping them use MITRE to enhance their functionality, MITRE ATT&CK to enhance their functionality, and also worked with our internal research teams, both hands-on and kind of in an overseer level, to kind of how we use it internally with the organization. So really excited to share kind of some of those insights with you and just kind of introduce these concepts with some slightly different light than maybe what you've heard in the past. Just some kind of fluff here now that everyone can hear me. Sorry again about that. Everyone's muted except for me right now. And you'll see that there's a couple different functionalities that you can use within our kind of content delivery. Feel free to ask questions. Thank you all for those who've mentioned that I was on mute. That was a big help. And there's some also content that you're free to navigate to related to MITRE, related to Vectra that you can peruse kind of outside of this webinar as well. To kick things off, I'm going to start with a quote. There are two hard things in computer science, cache and validation, and naming things. This is a true problem. Language and how we talk about things is incredibly important, and a lot of thought has gone into it, despite kind of what we take for granted in just the conversations we have day to day. One organization that kind of had a role to play in how we talk and name things in the past few years has been this organization, MITRE. They've deployed a lot of different frameworks in the security space. I'm going to talk to you about two of them today, but also talk about kind of the broad space of this kind of world that MITRE has played in terms of naming things. Because naming things is important. If we can name things, we can communicate problems to each other, we can solve those problems, and we can kind of keep ourselves secure in the world of security is really the focus. The two frameworks that I'm going to talk through today are going to be the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. MITRE ATT&CK is, the kind of real quick statement is, MITRE ATT&CK is about naming the things that attackers do to progress and evade defenders. That's the core of what it does. There's ways that we use it, but all it is a dictionary of what attackers do at the kind of simplest level. D3FEND, a slightly newer framework, is the counter to attack. D3FEND is naming the things, giving a dictionary of things that defenders can do to stop and prevent attacks. Kind of a yin and a yang here. Basically, we can see kind of how these two work together. And before I dive into the actual frameworks themselves, I just want to talk about this organization, MITRE, because if we understand the history of kind of where these frameworks came from, we'll be in a better position, I think, to leverage them and understand their intentions and kind of really take full advantage of what they've built. MITRE is an organization, actually, that's been around for some time. They first kind of reference to them, first thing they did was in 1958. They were part of a thing called SAGE. This was critical during the Cold War for tracking kind of missile defense systems that were happening. A very large project, interesting in its own right. From a history lesson, it was a project that was apparently cost more than the Manhattan Project did. And this was MITRE's first kind of project, and it started what is now a long history of federally funded research, basically to solve tough problems. They've done a lot throughout the years. In 1985, they were the first organization with a .org in their name, a small little thing, but an interesting fact of kind of their step into cyber world and internet world. They've had a big, important role in the development of the STIX framework for doing kind of threat intel detections and building a way of communicating relationships there. And that kind of is a precursor to some of the things we are today is those frameworks, those mappings. Because then in 2015, they released ATT&CK, kind of the focus of the conversation today. And then in 2021, they released D3FEND. All this kind of to say that the MITRE organization kind of checks the box for being a group of folks that are really focused on solving problems and have a history of it, enough to the point where they've got the reputation where we can trust them, that what they've put out there has merits, has been thought through, outside of really when you start to dig into it and see for yourself. So with that kind of foundation, I'll double click into these attack and defend and start to talk through these. Now, still on that history check, because I think the foundations of these are interesting and important to understand how we use them. Attack itself started kind of from a project that MITRE was running in the kind of their nonprofit functionality that they do. In 2010, they were running war games effectively, where they had a live attack lab where they were testing different attackers basically in this lab to see what they could do. Different APT groups, they were documenting what they would do, the different APT groups, what they would do, and then they would be documenting basically their ability to detect those actions that were taking. It really focused on a post-compromise view to try to understand defenses as it exists. And the goal here was, how well are we doing at detecting documented adversary behavior? A question that all security organizations ask even to this day. But the real spin that they had on this was these folks, they wanted to not just be listing out CVEs and IPs and kind of these low-level indicators that are hard to really talk broadly about. They wanted to categorize them in a way where they can actually measure themselves, where they can really talk about the coverage and communicate with each other about what it is that these APT groups were doing that was similar, what was different, and what were the things that they cover. So, they would move from, CVEs, from IPs, from these kind of very hard to track, millions of them effectively, different types of indicators to behaviors. So what they would be able to do at the end of this project is they had a set of things, boxed out where, they could say we have coverage and techniques to cover purple, orange, blue, and without having to worry about the actual idiosyncrasies of what those specific things were, and take it at a behavioral level, because behavioral level focus really lends itself to taking big strides in terms of defenses. The evolution of that was they spent a little time of it having MITRE, basically a framework, MITRE ATT&CK Framework, as something that they had in their own internal lab. And then they eventually made it public a few years later. And that was resulted in the first release of the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, this kind of diagram that you can see on the left. This was all focused on post-compromise. It was all focused on what it is that attackers do once they get in. What are the steps? Not kind of the stuff that happens before, but what are the steps that come in? And in the framework they created, it was focused on things that were broken down by tactics. And this is still how it exists today, where tactics are goals that adversaries have during an operation. So these can be things like establish persistence. That's a goal of an attacker. These things can be privilege escalation, escalate their privileges, set up a command and control. It can be collect data. All these different things that attackers are trying to do in the name of their operation. Now, if you look at kind of things that are out there today or kind of have come out in the similar time frame of this, there's other frameworks out there that list these broad sweeping categories. The Lockheed Martin kill chain is a good example. But what this does that's really different is it added this technique flavor to it. It added basically these definitions of the broad TTPs that attackers do. And these are the actions they do, the techniques. And in the first framework here that they put out, there was 96 different techniques that came into play. Now, of those 96, they were all relevant to Windows. The kind of first scope of the first attack matrix was Windows, and it was all endpoints. So no cloud. Cloud wasn't really in vogue at that time or really around as a thing, but no kind of talking about Windows, or no talking about Macs, no talking about Linux. That was the kind of first version of this that came into play. And since then, basically, there's been a lot of updates to this. MITRE is kept up to date with new views of the world here. They create different techniques. They develop different tactics based off of observations in the real world. They look to see what attack groups are doing, what threat reports are out there, and they update accordingly with that. And it's a judgment call. These are humans on the other end. They're making decisions of what they come in, and I'll talk a little bit about that human factor that contributes to this. But what the result is that exists today is there's now this really clear language that they put out there of the tactics, of kind of the objectives that attackers have, broken down right now into 14 things that range now not just from the kind of post-compromise sense, but also into the things that happened before, basically the way that they do reconnaissance as opposed to discovery, which happens internally, to find ways in. And now within all these different tactics, these different objectives attackers have, there's also techniques, more techniques. We're at almost double the original one that are broken down also even further into sub-techniques, where sub-technique is effectively basically a kind of fine-tuned version of a technique, a specific of what the actual attacker would do in a given scenario. And all these techniques and tactics actually are broken up into different domains or different areas. There's 10 domains plus an additional kind of completely separate view that's related to mobile and kind of pre-attack scenarios. In the 10 domains that they exist today, they're ranging basically from Windows to Mac to Linux into SaaS, Azure AD, Microsoft 365, Google Cloud, and IaaS. IaaS being kind of their current representation of public cloud, which factors in both kind of the infrastructure as a service component of public cloud, as well as the platform as service functionality. Now, what's really interesting and powerful about what they did in this language, and this is where we start to get into how we can think about using MITRE ATT&CK, is best represented kind of when you start to think of this classic security talk kind of graphic here is the pain pyramid. I'm borrowing this kind of concept to bring this up in the context of MITRE from a talk MITRE themselves did, with kind of my own personal spin on it. When we look at things that are out there in this pyramid that we as defenders look at, when you look at things from tools below, that these kind of things that are easy to put in place from a defender perspective and easy to call out, there's millions of them. So they're easy to do one or two of them. They're hard to do all of them. And they stack on top of each other as kind of the graphic shows. And they're a challenge from two things from a defender point of view of leveraging these. The first is when it comes to talking about things, about attacks, they're really inconsistent from a language perspective. If we look at them and try to talk about what an attack is, and you start talking to someone with hashes, you're going to sound crazy, and we're never going to move forward anywhere. It's really challenging. You can try to start talking about maybe domain names, it gets easier, tools, it gets easier, but it's really a hard way to actually talk coherently about what an attack is when we use that as the language. From an actionability standpoint, because the language that we're talking here is so varied, there's so many things. When we talk about coverage for anything with that language, we're in also a hard spot because we can't talk about big swaths of things. There's millions of things to talk about. So knowing what we have coverage for is really hard, and developing coverage then, because we can't talk about it, is also really hard. But the TTPs, which is really what attacks focused on, what MITRE ATT&CK is focused on, there's only a couple hundred of them. So we can really start being actionable in what we do and how we talk about things. There's a consistent way to talk when you have hundreds of things that you can say, or 100 things to say, as opposed to a million. We can all understand each other. We can all think about the problem in a similar way. We can all act in a similar way in regards to threats when there's hundreds of things to look at instead of millions. And it means that when we develop coverage within this framework, when we develop coverage for one of those things, we are simultaneously having coverage for millions of them. This is something that I fundamentally have seen as a successful way to approach this, because behavioral approaches that attackers do behaviors, they do things. If we detect those things broadly, we have coverage for them, and we don't have to worry about the minutia here. We can kind of get to what attackers can't avoid effectively. When we look at what MITRE did in any of these TTPs that they have, in any of those tactics, they broke down a lot of information here in terms of attack of what's there. In any of the different techniques that are listed, there'll be a lot of information. I picked kind of one that really classic one in my mind of behavioral level is something called valid accounts as a technique here. Valid accounts is one of my personal favorites because it is the most generalizable, generic kind of statement of what an attacker can do, is they compromise a valid account. It's a great thing, and I'll say also, to say this is what the attacker did, but when we talk about coverage for it, this is where it starts to get really tricky and hard. And so we use that as kind of a lure for things ahead. But with each kind of attack page that they have for a technique, you'll see the tactics that are relevant to it. Multiple tactics involve a valid account. the domains that are relevant here. So you can see Azure AD, Google Workspace, all these different places, the permissions user has required, and then the kind of defenses that are bypassed by having this technique in place. Beyond that, you also get, with every technique, a mapping to different attack groups and tools that leverage those techniques, again, in the communication that enables us to have a kind of codified statement of what's done, as well as some kind of less than kind of developed on MITRE's side right now, things about migrations and detections. It's really tough to leverage these, I'd say, in a lot of ways right now, because they're pretty broad strokes in terms of when they talk about detections and things like this. In the case here, if you look at how they talk about detecting valid accounts, they say configure robust and consistent account activity policies, and they say monitor logs for access. Those are true statements, how you can detect a valid account, but they're much harder to do in practice. And it's kind of some of what the MITRE has overall as an organization has started to kind of act on in some of these other frameworks I'll talk about. With that backdrop, I want to talk about how actually as a practitioner, now that we have this language, what does MITRE say that we should use this language to do, and some caveats around using that language. At a very practical level, how we can use MITRE is there's a great way to use it is actually through MITRE's website, MITRE ATT&CK's website. There's this Navigator. It's effectively a kind of interactive framework where you can highlight different techniques, you can annotate it, you can add colors. I'll show in the next couple slides examples of us of using those and how you can use it. But it's a great way to explore a specific question about the attack framework and to study and learn it. Again, this is a language we're talking about, and knowing what that language means is kind of part of the how we leverage it. And so in that first use case and really the core use case of attack is language, is MITRE ATT&CK enables us to talk about attacks. You can see, this is an example of using that Navigator and using MITRE ATT&CK to document what it is an attack group does. Now, Bellium is a kind of infamous group. They are behind the SolarWinds type of attacks and a few other kind of things, very active in Azure AD in terms of their techniques. And we can see that in the breakdown here with this kind of framework. It maps out what it is the attacker does. We can talk about it, we can understand it, and then you'll see in a few, we can talk about coverage in context of this attack. But the first thing is we can see what it is they do. We can apply that same technique and technique approach of mapping things to tools themselves and document which techniques are involved by a certain tool, because a tool only has certain behaviors and certain functionalities, and if we can map those out, we can see exactly what it is to do. So it's not just saying we detect a tool, but what aspect of a tool, because a tool is a capability at the end of the day. And this conversation that we have about this MITRE ATT&CK doesn't have to be something that's, these specifics that are kind of historical events of things in the past. It can be what we're doing today in terms of communicating basically what's happening in a red team, communicating what happened during an incident. This is a great way to talk about it in a very broad stroke way that's actionable and understandable to basically act and work with this in a practical way so people can take actions. With that, we start to kind of bleed into this other use case of mapping and documenting coverage. So with that tool of being able to highlight, being able to talk about it and see it, you can talk about where you are today. So organizations have the ability to track with their vendors, track with basically look and see if we can understand what capabilities we have as defenders already and map those against this framework and keep that as a catalog. So we can see how we're getting better, what we're doing. And because the framework is in this kind of tool that they gave us is annotatable, you can keep track of things, you can make notes. And so one thing that I've kind of encouraged a lot of folks to do is to track this framework basically for themselves and map their coverage there. Lots of vendors, including ourselves, have layers that you can import in here, and you can see exactly what the coverage is, and you can start to understand your organization's footprint and capabilities as it relates to MITRE and the coverage that's there. The last thing that kind of as a use case that comes with MITRE ATT&CK, now that we can say what attackers do, is we can start to think through what type of coverage we may want to build for things that we have. So if we know what to talk about an attack, from technique-wise. If we then know basically the techniques that we have coverage or don't have coverage for, we can then say, what can we do to fill those gaps? And so because of the documentation within each technique, we understand what it is. We can start to think about new preventative controls, new detection alerts that we can build with that information. Now, I can say we can start to, because it's again, easier said than done. The kind of framing of detections in attack is kind of not the focus. It's about what the attackers do. That's the language there. And there's some hints of how to detect. But it sure would be nice if there were names for what the defenders should do to stop these things. What is to respond to these things? And that kind of cues up Defend, the framework that I'm going to talk about next. But I want to make sure before I jump into Defend that I talk through some of the caveats about using attack. Because with everything out there, it's not perfect. And it can't be perfect, and we're not all perfect, and that's okay. But it's important to understand the limitations that are there. The first one, and to be clear, these are things that MITRE themselves as an organization will readily admit. The list of things in attack is not exhaustive. It can sometimes lag what attackers are actually doing out there in the wild. And that's because decisions have to be made at a human level about what they want to enable in terms of kind of the framework and what's out there. There's a lot of things attackers are doing. They're not always all adapted. An example of Forge web credential tokens. This was kind of the SAML signing certificate actions that attackers did, that Nobelium actually did during the SolarWinds attack. That was reported on December 13th, and MITRE then added it afterwards. So it was a little bit slow in reporting to that action, which is okay. You know, everyone's trying to be ahead of these things, and it's tough. But from a defender standpoint, you know, it means that if you are aware of threats that you are concerned with, or you see threats that are out there that you're concerned with, just because they're not on MITRE doesn't mean they shouldn't be on your radar for things to track and think through and fit within the framework of your defense. All these techniques, as they are documented here, are post-compromise techniques or kind of related attack techniques that are existing in context. That valid account technique is an example, but also just as a different one is this one that's called file and directory discovery. You know, an attacker will search for files in the exact same way as an attacker. So us having coverage for that and working towards coverage, there's some challenges there if you just are purely doing that technique from a testing perspective, from a just kind of defensive building perspective. The context, and they even say this in their actions of how to build detections, is important. The context of the things that happened before and after any of these techniques is important. It's very easy to say file and directory discovery was a technique that was used, but being able to, as a defender, act on that is a hard thing because it's the context oftentimes the key here. So the action kind of that should be taken from this is to think through always when we're talking about these, the context around it, and try to leverage out the context as well as the individual actions that are taken. When we think about using MITRE as a guide for our coverage, all these things that I've kind of led before are kind of feeding into this. It's not a checklist of this is everything that you need to do to be covered. You have to have coverage for all these things. The end goal is to prevent a breach. It's not to have a checklist of every single one of these things. And getting 100% coverage for things is just not possible. There's going to be some of these events that every security team will have slipped through in terms of there's no alerting or defense around. And that's okay. The important thing is to be able to look at the aggregate level of your security, have means with which to grab all these alerts that you may have or all these different pieces you have, correlate those together, and have clear signal of the breach that's happening. So checking where your defenses are that actually matter and making sure that the full holistic attack is detected is the important thing, not necessarily the individual pieces of the problem is the thing to get focused on. Okay, with those caveats, we're going to skip back to kind of the other part of the talk on what we can do in these frameworks. And the other framework that we're going to talk through now is Defend. Defend is basically, again, the other side of the coin of attack. And it directly responds to that question I had before about, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a language to talk about how to respond to attack? And this DFEND framework, it's an interesting one, the way they've developed it. It's effectively a knowledge graph approach to the framework that they put in place for us. It starts from attack, but it makes the statement that every action that an attacker does in attack will generate a digital artifact. A valid account, for example, will log an event that says the account was used. A file search discovery will generate network metadata of basically an SMB share being touched. These network artifacts can be observed if we can collect them, and then we can act upon them with countermeasures. And that's what DFEND is all about, is what are those countermeasures that can act on these digital artifacts produced by an attacker. And so the whole framework is built out like a map here. That's what it is. Kind of where it came from is, again, an important thing to look at here. It's relatively new. It's still technically in beta, but it's being developed actively. It's a joint effort from MITRE and NSA, basically. And it's really the end goal of this is really that counter to attack. It's to standardize the vocabulary to describe defensive security technologies. It is very principled in its approach to defining these countermeasures. The countermeasures are based off of patents, kind of documents that are out there in terms of documentation of attacks and basically technologies to detect them. And it is really focused on this view of, at least right now, what are the things that we know exist that are countermeasures that are being used today, be it in different tools or different publicly available kind of countermeasure frameworks that exist. The breakdown here is slightly different from attack. It still kind of has this two-tier of technique and tactic and technique, but there are differences in here because it's different for defenders. Tactics here are not about what the attackers do and they're trying to achieve. It's what defenders are trying to achieve. So it's about hardening, it's about detecting, isolating, deceiving, and evicting. And these things are all against the attacker. These are actions that we as defenders do against attackers. Those tactics, not underneath them, are countermeasures, the techniques, countermeasures in the DFEND framework. And these are the actions that we as defenders can take to harden, to detect, to isolate, all these things. And there's about 100 plus of them right now. It's growing. The last update was earlier this year. It's been updated a few times now, and I think they're committed, it looks like, to continuing to update this, which is excellent because it's a really powerful framework to talk about what defenders can do and how to stop an attack. What it looks like in terms of the anatomy here, for any of those boxes in this matrix here, you have, again, a description of what that countermeasure is. So a definition, an explanation of how it works, the artifacts that are involved, things to consider, and then talking about that artifact relationship, that relationship between basically the attack technique and then the artifact that generates it, and then the actual response. Each basically MITRE DFEND countermeasure, you can look at it and see then all the different techniques that are impacted. So in this remote terminal session detection countermeasure, you can see that the impact of having that type of coverage on your MITRE attack is high. All these boxes become checked and have basically now you have coverage when you have this countermeasure in place. In addition to this, kind of the foundations for this, for those that want to investigate more, they're all listed. So the different kind of knowledge base frameworks that were used to define this countermeasure are listed, and patents that are relevant will also be listed underneath each of them. The Navigator here, that kind of framework that I told you to explore MITRE, that exists, MITRE ATT&CK, that exists also for DFEND. It's a little less interactive, but it's still pretty powerful and lets you study this language and understand how it relates to attack. The key things if you look at it and navigate there on your own is you can look up any technique to find different defender countermeasures that can be implemented. And you can also look up any defender basically countermeasure and see the techniques that kind of come up alongside of it. And then in the middle here is the artifact. So this kind of really shows you that graph structure flowing through here from left to right to interact with. So with that as what it is, how should defenders start to look to leverage defend, even if it is in beta? Because there's definitely value of looking and trying to leverage some of this stuff now. The first is to develop some of these countermeasures themselves. So the countermeasures that are documented talk through what type of functionality is out there that exists today that can respond to attack and has this type of ability to help. And this can give a great thing for teams that are able to build within their organization to develop countermeasures that fit within these kind of concepts. It removes the need to research them themselves, and it really helps kind of guide light in terms of what can be done in terms of building a capability and a countermeasure. The other thing is to help facilitate conversations with vendors. You can use this as a framework to guide the capabilities that you want to acquire. You can ask a vendor to show you what countermeasures they have enabled in the product, and that'll give you immediately a sense of not just what basic coverage they have, but how they're executing on that coverage, what countermeasures are in play in the product that you're looking to acquire that can respond to MITRE ATT&CK. And so it's a little bit more of a direct, how are you doing it question that you can ask and help you understand. And again, some of the caveats about attack apply here. You know, it's not an exhaustive list of things here, but it definitely helps guide you in a direction where you can think through and talk about what your coverage is and understand what's there. To wrap things up, I want to kind of give some key takeaways with this as the background. I hope this is useful to understand kind of the two frameworks at play here. And so the kind of top two when we talk about attack is what it is and how we can use it. And the number one thing of what it is it's a dictionary. It's a language that lets it talk about attackers and what they do. And it's worth studying it. It's worth learning it, because if we can talk about it, we can share information and we can improve all of our joint security, basically. And the second piece, by being able to talk about it, we can be able to measure things. We can know what to measure. We don't have to focus on the indicators that are not the strongest, that are not the kind of large ones. We can focus on these TTPs that give us coverage for things into the future, not just that what exists today. And the last thing is this new framework defend is what it is and how you can start using it is, you know, it's a language for defenders to start adopting, to start looking to consider. It gives the guidance for how to achieve two here in terms of the takeaways. It gives the guidance for what things are available, what capabilities that are out there that can directly stop and harden you and do all these tactics that defenders do in light of what the attackers are trying to do. And so I think that closes kind of the main content. I just wanted to give a little brief preview of kind of how we at Vectra look at this, because I think it's important to see just kind of an organization, we're a vendor, but you know how we've leveraged it for your own information. MITRE ATT&CK for us, it's core to our kind of view of what coverage is, with that caveat that it's you know not always perfect in terms of everything. So it's one of our guiding lights. We have other ones. We do our own independent research. We see lots of attacks in our organizations, and our teams are active in managing response to those in a lot of ways. And so it is a guiding light that helps define our coverage. And we've been proud. You can explore it yourself with some of the links that we've provided, but we have over 90% coverage for the relevant techniques to the areas that we're focused in. And all of our detections have MITRE T numbers that are associated with them that are directly available in the product for those that want to explore that. The other thing that's really unique about how we use it, and it's something that I think other organizations can use as well, is it helps driver prioritization for when we talk about an actual attack that's happening. You can use it basically as a means to correlate things together. An attack isn't going to be a single technique. An attacker has to use multiple techniques together. And if you think about that fact, you can come up with some interesting concepts. We have an AI algorithm in our product that correlates techniques together when it sees groups of them, and is able to then infer basically the priority of a response that's necessary. So it really goes from just looking at single events to looking at the collection of behaviors that are involved in an attack. The last piece here is just kind of how we leverage it in terms of kind of that interaction with defend. We're really proud that this was kind of outside of our knowledge when DEFEND came out. We've been referenced, 10 of our patents were referenced in the DEFEND framework. And we've mapped out basically our impact on DEFEND, and we have our products offering of DEFEND, the countermeasures, and we support about 30+ different countermeasures in the Vectra product. So with that as kind of the content, I'm happy to dive into some question and answers for anyone that's out there. There's some additional information that's also put, I think, in the application that we're running this out of. So feel free to ask the questions in the Q&A, and then feel free to explore any of this kind of additional content if it interests you. I see one question that came in: how much of the DEFEND framework should organizations try to implement? So I can tell you that kind of MITRE's guidance here is, it's not an exhaustive list of the things that are out there due to countermeasures, but it's kind of a explore what's there and understand the techniques that you feel you need to respond to on the attack side, and then look to leverage DEFEND as the guidance for responding to those. I can tell you, if you have a lot of DEFEND countermeasures in place, you're doing pretty well in terms of your defense. But it is not an exhaustive list. If you look at kind of all the MITRE ATT&CK techniques, not all those have a DEFEND countermeasure mapped against them. And you can see that if you actually plug in some of the techniques. I think even that file discovery one that I was talking about earlier, if you plug that in DEFEND, there won't be necessarily mapped back out. So it's something that is right now, it's good to have as much of it as you can, I think is kind of the statement there. Is there some training out there on DETACK and DEFEND? Not that I'm aware of that kind of, that MITRE themselves have put out. I know in interacting with different people out there, it's a kind of choose your own journey, and we as a community are all trying to help each other figure out ways to best leverage and use it. I encourage you to kind of explore, starting really from, if I gave you any guidance to start to explore it yourself, it's start from that Navigator page and start to explore the techniques that are there and understand it with that light of this is a language. And then on the DEFEND, same thing, go to that kind of homepage there and explore there. And that'll get you to the part where you can start to understand and then reflect on the language and how you can look towards building coverage there. What would you recommend to complement DEFEND? Oh, sorry, just a couple of questions flowing in. Okay, it was, what would you recommend to complement DEFEND to get the required coverage? So that's a hard thing. I think part of it is we have to keep watching DEFEND as it matures and grows, to the part where we have a more comprehensive view of what countermeasures are out there. So I don't have immediate guidance for how to look at that. I think the best thing is to start to look at some of the kind of older view of what they list in the how to detect sections of the attack techniques, because it does give you hints of what you can implement there, but it's not perfect. DEFEND is a much better way to talk about how to respond to these. So I don't have a great view today, other than kind of we have to wait and see what DEFEND does and continue to look at kind of MITRE's references for how they talk about detecting it. Someone said that it's hard to use the Navigator and figure out how to actually leverage it. It can take a little bit of learning curve. I don't have a great answer for that one. I think there may be some things that I've seen also, though, on YouTube that you can check also for how to use the Navigator. MITRE has definitely stepped up their kind of documentation here, but it can be tricky to kind of get started from zero. Why are patents referenced in the DEFEND framework? I think in MITRE's write-up of DEFEND, when they published a paper on it when it came out, they wanted to basically be sure that they were as principled in documenting countermeasures. There's a lot of countermeasures out there, but talking about what they are, patents is a great way to kind of point to something that's thought through, that has been studied, that is in some ways academic, in nature. And that is a great place to start from, because in the end of the day, this is a bunch of researchers, the MITRE organizations, a bunch of researchers looking at this. And so papers, white papers, patents, these types of things are great references to justify this as a thing to look through. There's a question here, are the defend and attack frameworks completely vendor agnostic, or are there some vendors that are preferred to counter against particular countermeasures? So they're completely agnostic. The MITRE organization is a nonprofit. They are focused on putting the best languages in both the attack side and the defend side out there. I've seen them do this consistently. It's collaborative. You'll see both vendors and independent groups are referenced there in kind of as both attack technique originators for having seen them in attacks, and for defend countermeasure originators having put those in place. So there's no allegiances they have there. They're completely a third party, which is good. There should be a trusted resource that sits kind of outside of vendors in general, and we can always look to them for kind of a non-biased view of what works and what may not. Do you think any missing piece on MITRE defend? So I think defend right now, is focused on kind of like the origin of attack. MITRE defend is focused on, really focused today on Windows and kind of Mac and Linux. There's some hints of accounts. You can see there's one defend technique is about monitoring logins and stuff that starts to talk about Azure AD and sign-on functionality there. But basically, it is still really focused on the network on the endpoint side. Kind of, again, their origins are in the MITRE organization there. So the cloud is something that they can look to improve, and I hope to start seeing more from them on the cloud side of what we can do as defenders. What challenges have organizations ran into by blindly adopting attack without accounting for signal-to-noise ratio and completeness versus actionability? This is a great question. This was kind of the kind of caution points that I had there on the attack kind of technique side. You can adopt it. You can start to look at it as a means of measuring your coverage. But if you don't look at it in the context, you can have a really tough time. The valid account technique means that anytime an account used, that technique is technically there. But having a detection mechanism that says anytime an account is triggered doesn't help you. Anytime an account is used doesn't help you. The defend countermeasures, on the other hand, when you look at that and look how they talk about accounts, you see they get into specifics of the context when it actually triggers, when to trigger an alert. And that's kind of how you start to get into this world of signal to noise ratio, because you can't detect everything all the time always, and you don't need to. It's about that finding a broad attack, not individual events, that ends up being the most important. Do you have any good examples how AI and ML has been used with attack and defend? Or do you think that there are any specific areas AI and ML can help to better use attack and defend? So I think, the use of AI in this space and in security, it's on the defense side. Attackers, you'll hear people say that attackers are using AI and ML, and they may be using some faint level of AI and kind of intelligence in their systems, but by and large, they don't need to, because it's such a hard problem on their own for defenders to respond to. Defenders are the ones that need AI, and that's the place where AI needs to be invested is on the defender side, and they're core to really the defend countermeasures. If you look at a lot of the countermeasures that are documented, a vast majority of them are AI focused, and this is not because it's the fancy technology, it's because it is the way to get at that top of the pyramid. You can't get to those TTP detections without being smart in how you execute against those. So if you look at defend, a lot of those are in the language may not be readily apparent in how they're written, but if you dig into them, especially in the patents, there's AI being leveraged there. And so it's a really powerful thing in terms of how you can respond. This is why, again, personally, we at Vectra, we are an AI shop. That's how we detect things, because it's the only way to get to that top of that pyramid effectively. So I think that was the last of the questions I can see here. Let me scroll down just to check. Let's see. If you are using MITRE ATT&CK in an organization and there's an update, what should we do to handle it? This is always a challenge, is how you handle updates to attack when you're leveraging it in an organization. They've done some steps now in the last few versions. There's an auto update that'll let you walk through basically how changes have happened. Techniques may merge together or split. And so it's an exercise for a team to go through when there's an update to start to leverage that. You can download old versions of the Navigator and deploy them internally if there is a need to maintain that on your own. And you can continue to leverage an old, an old MITRE Technique framework. But I encourage everyone to try to keep those up to date. I think that covers on questions. So I think I hope that this was useful. I really appreciate all the questions that came in, and I hope that you guys take a look at some of this content and explore amongst yourselves. I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you all.